President Obama has talked of cuts in security budgets of $400 billion over 12 years. The new US Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, is undertaking a comprehensive review to contribute to that aim. But he is clear, as I am, that we do not have to choose between strong fiscal discipline and strong defence. Indeed, in the longer term, one provides for the other. Thank you very much, Michael. No matter how much resource you commit, no matter how many great minds you employ, no matter how clear the analysis, it is impossible to predict with absolute precision when, where, and in what way Britain will find itself drawn into conflict in the future to protect the national interest and national security. We prepare, but we cannot know. Who would have predicted, at the time of the publication of the Strategic Defence and Security Review, that barely 2 months later, the desperate act of a street vendor in Tunisia would set off a wave of protest across the Arab world, demanding reform, toppling governments, blinking in the light of freedom? Who would have predicted that by the summer of this year, the Royal Air Force would have flown over 1,500 sorties in support of Operation Unified Protector as part of a NATO-led, UN-mandated coalition, stopping the forces of the Gaddafi regime from using the skies to brutalise his own people and degrading his ability to do so from land and sea? I didn't, and I doubt if anyone in this room did. But the point is this. Despite this lack of prophetic talent, the RAF has flown over 1,500 sorties and continues to contribute significantly to coalition operations in Libya. Working with our allies, the war machine Gaddafi has been using indiscriminately against his own people has been significantly degraded. The RAF alone has damaged or destroyed over 500 military targets, including command and control sites. In particular, the performance of Typhoon in its first multi-role contribution to operations has been fantastic. For some time now, we have relied on Typhoon to defend the UK and our dependent territories. Now Typhoon has truly come of age. In the last few months, Typhoon has flown over 1,700 hours, with the average hours flown per aircraft increasing fourfold, proving its versatility, endurance, and reliability. The outstanding performance of Typhoon is increasingly impressing those countries who are considering upgrading their fleets, as was clear when I visited India at the weekend. Of course, operations in Libya are not an RAF-only affair. The Royal Navy is off the Libyan coast, penning in the regime's maritime forces, policing the arms embargo, and contributing to strike missions. The Army is flying Apache helicopters off HMS Ocean, providing tactical flexibility to NATO commanders. All this has been achieved with crucial support from I-STAR and command and control platforms and from the air transport and refuelling fleet. And our armed forces are doing all this while continuing to focus energies on the main effort in Afghanistan, where 9,500 men and women from all three services face tough and dangerous challenges, as I saw again for myself in recent weeks. I'm not saying that this is easy, without cost or without consequences. It is very important that we recognise and reward those who are engaged in the very highest areas of conflict. That is why I can announce today that service personnel on operations in Libyan airspace and territorial waters will receive the operational allowance reflecting the rigours and risks that they are facing. Our forces currently on operations in Libya are performing brilliantly and at considerable risk to themselves. We regularly review the payments of the operational allowance that recognise the risks and hardships faced by our forces on operations. We have recently completed such a review and decided that it is only appropriate to extend the operational allowance to all those serving this country on operations in Libya. This will result in the payment of the operational allowance to anyone operating within the landmass, airspace and territorial waters of Libya, including all aircrew operating over the Libyan landmass, and to ships and submarines within 12 nautical miles of the coast. Payment is based on the number of days within the specified areas, and I'm pleased to announce that it will be backdated till the 18th of March, with funding coming from the reserve. In addition, in accordance with the agreed policy, those engaged in operations for which they are in receipt of the operational allowance on the day that individuals are notified will be excluded from the redundancy programme. Similarly, those on a dedicated operational workout package of up to 6 months or post-operational tour leave on the day of notifications will also be excluded. We will never have a crystal ball for international events, but it's precisely because we can't always predict that we have to prepare, plan and put in place contingencies for a range of capabilities against a range of scenarios. This is precisely what the National Security Strategy and the SDSR have done. It may not have mentioned Libya by name, but the National Security Strategy placed an international crisis drawing in the UK and its allies in the top tier of risks over the next 5 years. The planning assumptions in the SDSR allow for our armed forces to respond to a number of different scenarios, concurrent or otherwise. But this is where planning meets reality. We can and have planned for operations such as those we are undertaking, but no one can predict how long a complex intervention will take. Every scenario will be different, militarily, politically, and diplomatically. Sustaining the tempo does increase the pressure on both personnel and equipment as planning assumptions are tested, and it tests the ability of defence companies to support frontline operations. We all accept that, but the costs of the Libya campaign are being met from the Treasury Reserve, not the MOD budget. In the MOD, we must use our skills to match resources with commitments in the right way for the circumstances. That is our core business. Of course, no one wants the operations in Libya to take a day longer than necessary. But the bottom line is this: we can and will sustain operations in Libya for as long as it takes. That is what our national interest requires, and that is what our commitment under our United Nations mandate to the people of Libya requires. We are not doing this alone, nor would we choose to. And as NATO operations continue, and as members of the alliance participating adjust to the pressures being placed on their armed forces, we will look to the breadth of capability that the alliance possesses as a whole to sustain the tempo of operations. Ladies and gentlemen, these are testing times for the country as a whole and for defence in particular. Testing times force us to make unpalatable decisions, but they provide key opportunities too. Let me take the difficulties first. The government is committed to eliminating the deficit in the public finances. The consequences of not taking tough action is there for all to see in the events playing out in the Eurozone. Economic power is the wellspring of strategic strength. Without it, we will not be able to afford in the long term the public services our country needs and the military forces required to meet the needs of Britain's security and protect our interests around the globe. But this means tough decisions across public spending, including in defence. Such action is not confined to the United Kingdom. President Obama has talked of cuts in the UK security budgets of $400 billion over 12 years. The new US Defence Secretary, Leon Panetta, is undertaking a comprehensive review to contribute to that aim. But he is clear, as I am, that we do not have to choose between strong fiscal discipline and strong defence. Indeed, in the longer term, one provides for the other. In the Ministry of Defence here in the UK, we face the added pressure of tackling the long-ignored black hole in the defence budget bequeathed to us by a decade of over-programming. If we do not do so now, the inevitable consequence will be a severe recalibration in the future. And I know of no mainstream voice arguing for that kind of retrenchment. We have also embarked on reforming the way we go about managing defence, because if we do not, the systemic problems that have allowed this situation to build up will simply repeat themselves over time. This is the opportunity in adversity. Taken together, the SDSR and the reform of defence management proposed by Lord Levine provide the blueprint for sustainable, well-managed and formidable armed forces, structured for the rigours of the future character of conflict, able to swiftly adapt to circumstances and operate with allies, fully able to provide for the defence of the United Kingdom in an age of uncertainty. It is exactly because of the unpredictability of this volatile world, exactly because of the continuing need to use military force to protect Britain's interests at distance, that the SDSR places such a premium on the flexibility and adaptability of our armed forces. And air power and the Royal Air Force are a central component of this vision. When I became Secretary of State for Defence, there were voices, strong voices, urging me to merge air operations fully into the other services. But I'm clear that the RAF makes a definable and unique contribution to Britain's defence, a contribution that it would be wrong to dispense with. Some say the distinct heritage and tradition of the RAF is immaterial, as it does not have a demonstrable monetary value. I believe that the cost of something does not always demonstrate its value. We cannot afford to lose the doctrinal understanding of air power and its effects, which is burned deep into the collective fibres of the force. The value of the RAF is not confined to history, far from it. Today, the RAF is operating across all 4 enduring air power roles on current operations in Afghanistan and Libya, in addition to the standing operational commitments of defending Britain and our overseas territories. First, securing control of the air, guaranteeing freedom of manoeuvre and action to coalition forces, while severely curtailing the options of our adversaries. Second, delivering intelligence and real-time information to support commanders and decision-makers at every level. Third, providing global reach through strategic lift and theatre support through tactical lift. And fourth, delivering firepower rapidly and with precision. Air power remains critical to the 21st century battle space. At this conference, I have no doubt that we will hear many perspectives on the utility of air power, not least from the Chief of the Air Staff later today. I want to talk about 2 particular areas: joint operations and international operations. You will also know that today Lord Phillips is publishing his report on the Mull of Kintyre accident, and I will be making a statement on this in Parliament today, so you will understand why I cannot comment further on that issue at the moment. From its very establishment as an independent service in 1918, the Royal Air Force has recognised that despite standing alone as a profession, the utility of air power resides in achieving effect not only in the air, but integrating into other domains and contributing decisive effect to campaigns on the land and on the sea. The concept of joint operations is in the very DNA of the RAF. So too is the concept of international action. The RAF came of age in World War II at a time when operating alongside allies was imperative for the survival of the country. Even when we famously stood alone in the ranks of the RAF who faced the Luftwaffe at the Battle of Britain were pilots from over a dozen other nations. And since the end of the Cold War, in the skies over Iraq, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and now Libya, the RAF has built up an unrivaled experience in working as part of wider international coalitions. The future character of warfare will demand both joint operations and the international integration of effort, and increasingly so. The level and sophistication of the integration between air and surface that has been forged in campaigns such as Afghanistan needs to be maintained and then taken forward. So too does our understanding of and interoperability with our main allies. Air power in all its forms is a key part of the advantage that Britain continues to hold over opponents. The RAF's long focus on flexibility and adaptability is suited to the unpredictability of future conflict, and operations in Libya are proving yet again how air power provides decision makers with vastly increased options in supporting the national interest. And I can envisage no future conflict in which air power will not be required. None whatsoever. Air power is, quite simply, mission critical. So let me turn to a couple of issues that our future RAF must grapple with to ensure that they remain at the forefront of aviation and of military evolution. First, the fleet itself. The roll call of iconic aircraft that the RAF has flown over its history is long and distinguished. Spitfire, Lancaster, Vulcan, and Lightning, among others. These aircraft are now joined in retirement by the Harrier and the Nimrod, which have served the people of the United Kingdom magnificently over the last 4 decades. These decisions were not taken lightly. Alongside the decision to reduce manpower, these were some of the most difficult, and alongside the decision to decommission Ark Royal, they were the most finely balanced. But to achieve the real savings required to put the defence programme towards balance, reductions in the number of platforms was essential. The period later in this decade, in which the Tornado GR4 force is drawn down and the Joint Strike Fighter comes up to speed, will be particularly challenging. Of course numbers matter, but as the late Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson said, good aeroplanes are more important. That is why I am particularly pleased with the performance of Typhoon as a multi-role aircraft in Libya. With the introduction of the world's first and only second-generation E-scan radar, Typhoon will remain at the forefront of aviation technology for years to come. It is also why I'm looking forward to the capabilities of the powerful and more cost-effective carrier variant of the JSF, or Lightning II, as it will be known, to be jointly operated, of course, with the Royal Navy. The overhaul in the consolidated transport fleet will see greater capacity and capability with the new Voyager tanker and A400M operating alongside C-17. With the additional capabilities provided by I-STAR programs, the RAF of Future Force 2020 will have one of the most formidable and high-tech fleets in the world. And let me also be clear, the RAF will continue to rely as much on its people as on its platforms. The human underpinning of the RAF, the commitment, talent, and technical understanding of the men and women who serve, will be the difference between success and failure. That's why I find any polarized position between manned and unmanned aircraft as an utterly false choice. I agree with Admiral Mullen, the US Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that we are at a time of transition in future aviation in terms of remote technology. But 2 things strike me. First, a UAV is a sophisticated flying machine with sensors and weapons. But unless it has a skilled set of human beings operating it, interpreting the data it provides, and making real-time decisions, it has absolutely no impact. Second, we are some way away from remotely piloted systems being able to deliver all that manned aircraft can. That doesn't mean that we don't have to research, develop, and invest in remote piloted technology for all 3 services, and we will do so. But for the foreseeable future, it will be a combination of the speed, payload, and survivability that only piloted systems can currently supply, complemented by the persistence and flexibility of remotely piloted air systems that deliver the overall air power effect that is required. Let me conclude on this theme of the utility of people. I've seen for myself, on many occasions, what the RAF can do, from my time as a GP with the Royal Army Education Corps in Beaconsfield to Tango Ramp at Kandahar Airport. I know it's not all about fast jets. I see the work of those at the less glamorous but equally critical end. Keeping the air bridge up and running, keeping our forces supplied, the force protection provided by the RAF regiment, the medics, the mechanics, the armourers, the analysts and the air traffic controllers, all the support staff that keep the organisation delivering at the sharp end. In Air Chief Marshal Sir Stephen Dalton, the RAF has a Chief of Staff who not only directs his own service with insight, commitment and tenacity, but just as importantly, who understands the application of military power across the three services. He is supported in his efforts by some of the most capable and dedicated men and women in the armed forces. There have been times in our history when the light blue line was the only thing that stood between us and defeat. And I know, if so called upon today, this generation will take the fight to the enemy no matter what the cost. The people of this United Kingdom know that the Royal Air Force will never let them down. Thank you.
Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed for those very welcome announcements on allowances. Even more welcome to hear that they're coming from the contingency reserve. The comments you made, the perspectives that you offer, and some of the personal comments that you made, which I know are pretty heartfelt. So let's open it up to questions. We have a few minutes before the Minister has to leave. We'll take them in groups of 2s or 3s. So this is your opportunity to ask a question or make a very brief observation. You will need a microphone because of the size and the acoustics in here, and it would be helpful if you would identify yourself, please, when you have a comment or a question to make. Who would like to begin? Either side. Oh, there's a hand over there. Sir, gentleman back.
Officer Cadet Johnson, Oxford Erney. Thank you very much for your speech, Secretary. But the main question is, when you said we'll stay in Libya as long as it takes, I think the main question is as long as what takes, because the mission that we're currently performing is very noble and admirable, but unless we have a very clear mission aim and end point, mission creep becomes almost an inevitability.
Okay, let's take another couple while we move on. The gentleman over there in the middle. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Greg Hammond from the Development Concept and Doctrine Centre. And also on the subject of Libya and the Arab Spring operations. These were the first tests, or unexpected tests, for the National Security Council construct. How well does the Secretary of State think that the construct is working 1 year and a couple of months into the government's term of office?
Okay, thank you. Take one more in this round, if there is one.
Let's answer them then.
Okay.
What are we required to do in Libya? It could not be clearer. Under UN Resolution 1973, it is to protect the people of Libya from a regime that is brutalizing and killing them. And until that threat disappears, we have an international obligation to continue in that task. And I would make this point, that when we talk about Libya, we need to be absolutely unequivocal in the signals that we send to the regime. The regime will take nothing but comfort from those who say that we may not have the nerve, we may not have the money, we may not have the capability. So let me be very clear again. We do not lack political resolve, we do not lack military capability, and we will see our mission through. And those listening in Libya should be absolutely crystal clear about that point. There will be no lack of commitment on the behalf of the Allies. How have the different elements behaved in the light of what's happening in Libya? Well, were it only Libya? Were we not also faced with problems in Syria, in Yemen, and in Afghanistan and Pakistan? one item on the NSC agenda would be a very welcome event. The NSC actually, I think, has grown, matured throughout this period. I think increasingly we've seen the complexities dealt with by the increasing complexities of the NSC itself. The fact that we have an NSC-L that sits for Libya, that we have specific NSC meetings for officials, means that we get an increasing amount of information. In fact, so much information comes to us through the NSC process, and we have so many meetings of the NSC and its associated committees that I really do wonder how on earth we managed any integration of our national security issues before we had this particular construct. It will be an interesting thing for academics to look at. The other thing I may just add, not in your question, but something that in Libya that did impress me enormously and which has not, in my view, had enough credit, was the speed at which NATO actually got up and running the operation itself. Far faster than NATO has done in previous similar events in history. And I think that's tremendously to its credit. But being a positive, and the story that is to its credit, unsurprisingly, it's never appeared in any of our press.
Thank you. Other points, questions? Sir, here, Brian Burridge. Sir Brian Burridge. There's a microphone just coming to your right-hand side, Brian.
Secretary of State Brian Burridge, President of the Air League and Finmeccanica. The success of air power in Libya has drawn a great deal on the body of knowledge that exists in this country, in which there are stakeholders as broad as military personnel themselves, politicians, civil servants, academics, and industry. One of the successes of Libya, in a technical sense, has been dual-mode brimstone. What lessons have you learned from the operation so far over the importance of being able to reach out and touch the industrial aspects of that body of knowledge?
Thank you. And there was a question further back. Just take the microphone back there, sir.
Tony Gillespie from the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. A very similar question to the previous one. You paid tribute to the supply chain for the current Libyan operations. You also mentioned the new radar for Typhoon. This depends, all of them depend very critically on the UK industrial base. How are we going to ensure that they are sustained in the way we need through the current round of uncertainty of funding?
Okay,
thank you.
The two, if I may be, two very, very good questions. First, Brian, on that widespread link from government through the military to industry. I have been enormously impressed, not to mention enormously grateful, for the speed at which industry has been able to respond to our requirements for our high-end weaponry. It does always, however, make me ask the question that why, when we need to, can we do things so quickly, when on a more regular basis we seem to do things so slowly? And why, when we need to, can we bring things in at cost, when otherwise they seem always to exceed them? And yet again, the lessons from what we do through a UOR process need to be incorporated into our wider thinking and practices. I learned a couple of things about what we use in terms of brimstone and other weapons we used. First of all, the amazing, as I said, the ability to produce them quickly, the amazing capabilities they had in the accuracy which they were unerringly able to provide us with, and because of that, the utility that it had both militarily and politically. Because if you are able to use weaponry of that nature with that level of predictability and accuracy, we can, as policymakers, set out very clearly, as we did, that we will take forward targets that will minimize civilian casualties. It is to the enormous credit of this country and to the alliance that we have carried out the conflict in Libya with an absolute minimum of loss of life of the civilian population. Not only does it show that we occupy the moral high ground with a much greater value on human life than Gaddafi has, but it also enables us internationally to maintain a political consensus that would have been difficult had the converse been the case. So I think that this has been a major triumph for our industry in terms of showing what they can produce and how in tandem with policymakers they can provide us with a huge international leverage. In terms of the UK industrial base, well, I make no secret about the fact that the best way to secure the industrial base is to increase Britain's share of international exports. The worst thing that we can do is to make the defence industrial base more dependent on the MOD budget and consequently on the UK economic cycle alone. It makes far greater sense when you want to protect defence jobs to ensure that we are evening out risk by exporting into as many markets as possible. And this government will continue to push British defence exports, as I did when I visited India at the weekend, and we will continue through our defence exports programme to continue to ensure that the UK retains its place at the top of the International Defence Exports League. You know, making things and exporting things, although an old-fashioned idea, may not be a bad way forward for an economy that needs to get back on its feet.
Thank you. Other comments? Right, let's go to the back on this side and then to the left on this side. At the back there.
Michael Codner from RUSI. Secretary of State, the Defence Reform Unit report made a lot of recommendations which have huge implications for the Royal Air Force and the other services, but it only goes so far, and there's an awful lot of unresolved questions as to what the final structures will be. When do you expect to be able to have made decisions as to what the new structure, in all the detail that it needs, will actually be made over operations and also over capability requirements?
Thank you. And there's a question in the middle here. Sir. It's okay, we've got a microphone coming from you. Hang on, sir. You're next. Sir.
Luke Van Beek from Raytheon. Looking forward, Secretary of State, when we go into the next Strategic Defence and Security Review, what do you expect to be different compared to this time as we went into it? And perhaps the corollary to that is, what do you hope will come out of it, the next SDSR?
All right. How long have you got? Sir.
Sir, Brigadier General Aksoy from Turkish Air Force. I think these days everybody is talking about the economic challenges which affects Europe, including the US. So there are a lot of challenges and taking some measures to escape this situation. But at the same time, as UK Ministry Defence, you have begun to procure Typhoon, but on the other side also you plan to have a GSF F-35, which is a very expensive tool. I know that because I'm one of the part of that one. Do you see, isn't there any dilemma? Because one side there is economic challenges, on the other side you are procuring very expensive tools. How do you explain this? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'll start with that one. You don't get good planes cheap. I mean, it's as simple as that. If you want the top end, if you want to maintain a lead in terms of technology and your military capability, you're not going to get it for the lowest possible price. And that is something we have to accept. Of course, if we want to do that, we may have to look at the size of the fleet that we order. We may have to look at other priorities within, for example, the RAF programme. We were very clear at the outset that we had to reduce fleet types. It's fleet types actually which are very expensive, and reducing the fleet types allowed us actually to get into a position where by 2020 we'll be using Typhoon, which will be increasingly capable, and JSF, which is of course as fifth generation, something that we will need to have, because those who might threaten us are likely to have it. As I always say, when you measure the cost of something, you have to measure against the cost of not having something. That is a fairly good way to begin a conversation, I find, with my Treasury colleagues. When it comes to the DRU, yes, it was a pretty radical programme that we put forward. We always knew it was going to be. There were voices from the outset that said, oh, Secretary of State, let's not have this Maoist approach to endless revolution. Why don't we have sequential changes at MOD? Well, let me tell you, sequential changes would have stopped after step one. Because that's the history, and that is why we're going for a widespread and difficult reform programme. But I think in terms of what we proposed in the Defence Reform Unit, whose work will be ongoing, and I expect to see it fully implemented by the time we get to the next comprehensive spending round, and I think the Department needs to be in that position. There were three elements, I think, that were important. The first was the board structure, having a more tightly drawn defence board, chaired by the Secretary of State. You know, if we were in the private sector, we'd be number 3 in the FTSE. The idea that the board is not chaired by the Secretary of State, I find completely bizarre. In fact, a very senior figure said to me recently, we're a bit worried about you chairing this board, not because we don't think you couldn't do it, but others might not be able to do it, which I find the most bizarre way of looking at accountability, because the person who chairs the board should be the one accountable to the British people through Parliament for that, not a civil servant. The second big area is devolution of power. I've long believed that the MOD centralised the wrong things and devolved the wrong things, and I want to ensure that I'm not trying to micromanage areas that politicians should not be micromanaging. If the single service chiefs, with their own devolved budgets, want to move some money from their equipment to their manpower budget or vice versa, that they should be allowed to do. If they want to each shape their services differently, one from another, because they believe that's in the interest of their service, then let them do it. There should not be a one-size-fits-all driven from 5th floor in main building. And I believe that giving greater control to the single service chiefs of the areas that they ought to control makes sense, but at the same time getting control in the centre, particularly of major projects costs, is the correct balance that we ought to have. And the other big change I think that matters in the long term is the concept of the fourth pillar, the Joint Force Command. And the reason that I was so keen on that is that, and the reason that I wanted a 4-star at the top, is that increasingly as we go forward, defence will be about a wider set of skills. It won't just be about the muscular end of defence capability, it will be about cyber. It will be about space. It will be the generation that understands those particular environments. And I want people who are willing to bring a life's commitment to defence to get a chance to get to the top in defence intelligence, in defence medical, in any of the areas that I mentioned. And I want to be able to say there are no glass ceilings inside defence. If you have the talent, you will be rewarded and you can rise to the top, and we will have to have those meritocratic and open structures as we go through this decade and the economy recovers and the military have to compete with the private sector for the brightest and the best. And on the issue of the next SDR, it's not even a year since the last one.
You enjoyed it so much you want to do it again.
Forgive us if we pause for breath. But I do intend to start the process for the next SDSR early, and we will be looking at the end of 2013 to begin the preparations for the SDSR of 2015. What would I like to be different? Well, what do I think will be different, more importantly? You know, knowing how much things really cost would be a really good beginning as we get into the programme, rather than estimating costs and then finding that they're constantly much greater than we previously thought, the endless frustration of ministers. So actually knowing what they are on paper as we go into the process, rather than sticking our finger in the air, I find a much more enticing prospect. What do I want to come out the other end? I want to come out with the elimination of the black hole in our budget, and with a proper matching of resources with aspirations. That was never going to be an easy task. It was always likely to be worse than we thought, and believe me, it was. But we owe it to our services, to our industry and more importantly to the people of this country to get properly back into a decent match our aspirations and the funding to make sure they become a reality.
Oh, can we take one more round of questions before we go? Right, let's go. 2 or 3 more questions, right. One at the back there, there's a microphone.
Secretary of State, you talked about the Libya campaign, but one of the most significant and most challenging aspect of that campaign has been the particular approach of the United States, which hasn't had the involvement in combat missions which we've seen in all the previous major operations we've had in the last decade. And I wonder whether you could comment on what lessons you would draw from the particular nature of US involvement in Libya, whether this is an exception or something we need to factor into our planning rather more, both in relation to the need to maintain a broad spectrum of sovereign UK capabilities, but also lessons for cooperation with other European states. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's a question on that side, sir.
Andrew Brooks, Director of the Air League. Secretary of State, when Lord Mountbatten set up the Ministry of Defence, it wasn't just putting everybody in one building. It was also, he said, there will be a joint, if you hire staff, i.e. everybody, once they got to Colonel, Group Captain, Captain RN, would join a purple list. The idea being that the Chief of Defence Staff would only get senior joint advice if he was responsible for their promotion. Did you ever look at this as an option when you were doing the SDSR?
Okay, one more finally. Sir. There we go. Sorry, there's a microphone just on its way.
Secretary of State Tim Bailo, Group Captain Strategy in France. As we move increasingly both transatlantic and within Europe to procure collaborative projects, including the Lightning II and remotely piloted air systems, how do you intend to ensure the UK defence industrial base, IPR and indeed operational sovereignty, while our associated governments are going to be doing exactly the same for their own nations?
Well, of course, any government needs to be very clear about what its absolute sovereign capability needs to be. I think it's very often over-egged, and I think that we very often get protectionism dressed up as principle. And we need to learn to cooperate with other governments. We're working with the French government on some elements of UAVs. We work with the United States on other elements of other programs. We need to learn to be collaborative where we can to get an economy of scale if we are not to spend a lot of money reinventing the wheel unnecessarily. There will be some areas where we will want to develop things particularly for our own use because we believe there is a major sovereign requirement to do so, and we will continue to do so. A good example is what we're doing with the nuclear deterrent. We'll continue to have a completely independently operated nuclear deterrent, but why should we not work with some of our nuclear studies with France, rather than both of us inventing at very high cost the same research facilities. So as long as we've got independent access, that's fine by me. So we need to be very cautious about when we use terms such as sovereign capability, that we're not dressing up one thing as something else. In terms of jointery inside the MOD, I'm very keen and as the setting up of the fourth pillar demonstrates that we not only become more purple, but we reward purple wherever we can. And we are looking, of course, and have said we will look at an increasingly close joint promotion structure. And we've got work underway to look at how we might make that a reality and how we might make the rewards greater for those who bring loyalty to defence as a whole. I entirely agree with that point. But one thing, and they'll excuse me, those in the audience, but you only have to talk to any Canadian Defence Minister to see how far the limitations are in that process. And when you talk to any of our Canadian colleagues, they say, do not go down the route of single service. It is a disaster, and please respect our experience on that one. So my view is take the best that you can from the services that we have and the traditions that they have developed, blend them together, create a fourth pillar rather than trying to merge the other services into something that I think would be detrimental to the general well-being of the country's defence. And finally, on Libya, the United States and what we've learned. The United States was very clear at the outset in Libya that they would provide us fairly heavy firepower for the early days. They would provide us with support for other operations. But the United States, with its heavy commitment in the Gulf, its commitment still in Iraq, it's much heavier than anyone else, let me remind everybody, commitment in Afghanistan, is quite clear and quite right that they cannot continue to shoulder the burden of everyone else's defence. And when we look at the sometimes pathetic contributions being made by some European countries inside NATO, and sometimes countries that were very keen to join NATO and started cutting the defence budgets almost immediately afterwards, there is a very clear lesson that if you want collective defence, you better start investing in it. And the European elements of NATO cannot expect the United States to come to their aid on every occasion. And the lessons that I've learned are the lessons we knew all along, that the United States is willing to spend on defence, Britain is willing to spend on defence and deploy. Far too few of our European partners inside NATO are still trying to get a free ride. And they should be regarding Libya as a wake-up call, that the US will not always be there to bail them out. And if they want the insurance policy, they should perhaps think about paying the premiums.
Secretary of State, thank you. You never let us down. We are very grateful for the amount of time you've been able to spend with us this morning, and we know that you've made a series of important statements, and it is your natural inclination to engage, and we know that. We don't take that for granted, incidentally. But you have engaged with us with, if I may say so, your characteristic clarity, empathy, and strength, and for that we are very grateful. Secretary of State, thank you very much. That's tremendous. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.